I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Bunurong traditional custodians of the land that I'm presenting from today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge the Indigenous children, families and communities whose participation in LSIC make my research possible. And keeping in those relationships in mind, today I'll share findings from 33 interviews with researchers who have published papers containing analysis of LSIC data. Through a meta-theme analysis, I identified 7 patterns distinguishing collaborative from extractive approaches to secondary data analysis, and also critically identified pathways for how researchers can transform from methods first to governance first orientations. So, Footprints in Time is otherwise known as the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, provides the context for my research. Before LSIC, there was no comparable longitudinal data set tracking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's development and well-being over time. And it's important to understand that longitudinal designs enable analysis of what cross-sectional research cannot. For example, how early childhood experiences, family circumstances, and community context shape developmental trajectories. And what makes LSIC unique in this context is its Indigenous Majority Steering Committee, with this governance structure representing a deliberate departure from prior research models where Indigenous peoples are primarily subjects of research rather than decision makers in research. This slide captures the fundamental problem that this research project addresses. Walter and Anderson's concept of statistical colonialism identifies what happens when governance becomes disconnected from secondary data analysis. So when researchers treat Indigenous data as raw material for extraction rather than information that is properly under Indigenous authority, the care principles, particularly the requirement for collective benefit that Carol and colleagues have articulated, make this concrete. Garrison's work with Indigenous families in longitudinal research revealed their expectations that research should be using their children's data would directly benefit their communities and not just advance academic careers. And recently, Katie Thurber and her colleagues have found the same with LSIC families, with those families and children's caregivers describing their participation as an opportunity for telling their story and creating their own history. And they also expressed clear expectations of reciprocity, that data would generate good statistics and be used appropriately to benefit their communities. So when secondary data analysis operates independently from Indigenous governance, these pieces don't fit together. They remain separate activities. My meta-theme analysis revealed 3 distinct patterns in how researchers approach this disconnection. Some researchers actively work to connect these pieces through ongoing relationships, establishing governance structures and relationships with community. Others proceed with technical analysis while acknowledging that governance exists somewhere out there, that the idea of governance research exists out there somewhere. This slide presents my theoretical model. So how governance first approaches should function in secondary data analysis, showing a fundamental shift from the traditional research paradigms. So when Indigenous governance directly shapes research methods design, it enables or it prevents extraction through 3 key mechanisms. First, Indigenous governance determines which research questions are appropriate and meaningful, rather than researchers imposing externally derived questions onto Indigenous data. So secondly, collective benefit is not added on as a mere afterthought or dissemination strategy. Rather, it's built into the research design from the outset. This means that the analytic framework is built into the research design from the outset, and it's structured to produce findings that serve the participating Indigenous communities, children and families. And thirdly, accountability runs to those communities whose data it is, and not just to institutional ethics committees. creating a different standard for validity grounded in cultural alignment and community recognition rather than solely in statistical criteria. The critical insight is that governance first framing doesn't necessarily or doesn't of necessity compromise research quality, which was a concern that I heard from several researchers that I interviewed. That governance first framing of research can improve validity of research, and that by being accountable to community governance, we can capture and reflect Indigenous realities and experiences more accurately than when we force Indigenous data into Western-based frameworks that weren't designed from the outset for these realities. So that's the model. And so we're going to talk a bit more about how research actually understand and engage with governance of research when they do secondary data analysis. 3 questions drove my interviews. These 3 questions. So while my project focuses on research with LSIC data, these questions can apply to secondary data analysis in many other cross-cultural contexts. So the first question is how researchers understand governance requirements. And there was striking variation in the responses and views with the researchers that I interviewed. And some of the interviewees couldn't articulate what governance meant beyond getting ethics approval within their university or institutional context, whereas others understood governance as fundamental to their research projects. The second question about methodological constraints exposed another diagnostic pattern within the interviewees. How researchers frame their identifying and reporting of limitations in their research is aligned to their broader research orientation, with people who prioritize governance framings, or with some people placing governance requirements in conflict with statistical requirements, or some placing them as necessary design features within a research project. The third question is about what distinguishes a collaborative approach in research from an extractive approach. And that led to the identification of the 7 meta-themes that I'll present shortly. So I guess for me, the critical insight about this is that without a shared conceptual framework for understanding what governance entails when we work with secondary data, that researchers default to their disciplinary training, and that disciplinary training rarely includes governance as a central consideration, similarly to what Emily presented earlier in her work on psychology as a discipline. I employed a method expertise responsive interviewing with the 33 interview researchers. With this methodology, I'm able to adapt the question depth and the technical language to the participants' expertise. I covered a range of generic and technical domains that are, I suppose, central to quantitative analysis in longitudinal and child developmental research. For instance, when discussing measurement invariance, I could ask statisticians about model fit indices and partial invariance decisions, while with community engaged researchers, I could explore whether cultural advisors should be consulted before specifying which group comparisons to test and how. The research protocol uses tiered questions, allowing me to meet researchers where they're at. The 33 participants ranged from early career researchers to emeritus professors across 7 disciplines, with the sample including former and current steering committee members. So that's the LSIC governance structure. And so representing people within that governance structure and not just researchers who are subject to the governance structure. And it's important to note that there's about 300 researchers who've had papers published containing analysis of LSIC data, and many of those are multiple author papers. So in most cases, I had first or second or final authors agreeing to participate. So it's quite a representative sample of that cohort. My analysis followed a protocol developed by Wootich and colleagues. It's a three-phase protocol. First coding each individual interview for themes, then comparing those themes across cases, whether that's career stage or discipline, research or discipline, and so forth, and then abstracting from to meta themes that capture variation in those patterns across the sample. And it's important to understand that the quality of my meta theme analysis depends on the quality of the interviews themselves. So I'll show you how the protocol worked in practice for one of the particular domains. So this is reciprocal causality, and this slide perhaps illustrates one of the deepest epistemological tensions that my protocol surfaced, which is the conflict between Western models, linear models of causality, and indigenous relational and holistic worldviews. So reciprocal causality or bidirectional causality refers to where relationships where variables influence each other over time. For example, where poor sleep might affect one's social and emotional well-being, or vice versa. And standard longitudinal methods attempt to disentangle these by modeling temporal sequences and separating out the contribution of each to the, I suppose, the model estimates and the model coefficients. So for a statistician, I could ask, how do you approach modeling reciprocal relationships when you're working with ELSIC data? And then that ideally will elicit technical information, comments about the type of models that they might fit, enabling me to follow up with pivoting to questions focused on governance considerations in terms of how they've involved communities in decisions about which causal pathways to model. Whereas for the community engaged pathway, I might open up that topic differently, asking researchers to reflect on how Indigenous holistic worldviews shape their analytic approach, surfacing a tension between Indigenous knowledge systems, which may conceptualize health and culture and family, community and connection to country as mutually variables that can be separated apart from each other. So the analysis followed the protocol established by Wooditch and her colleagues. It's intended to identify those patterns that transcend individual case variation. In the first phase, I coded all the interviews across 5 domains, how researchers conceptualize limitations, whether as technical problems, as cultural safety features, or as governance and ethics requirements, about coded their governance orientations, whether they perceived governance as a gatekeeping or understanding it as a form of knowledge holding, whether their approach to collaboration was performative or substantive, coding up how their disciplinary framings shaped their assumptions about what constituted legitimate knowledge, and also coded up reflexivity markers indicating whether the researchers recognize their framework as one perspective amongst many. In the second phase, I systematically compared these coded patterns across disciplines, career stages, and governance orientations, with my critical question being which patterns appear across multiple researcher types and which are specific to certain positions and positionalities. This stage of analysis revealed that seniority didn't predict the researcher's governance orientation, and that early career researchers sometimes demonstrated deeper integration of governance considerations with their research practice than more established researchers. In phase 3, I abstracted across the case patterns into 7 meta themes, with negative cases proving essential. So cases that sort of went against how I was conceiving of the meta theme. For example, one early career non-Indigenous researcher demonstrated principled refusal despite career costs. They refused to publish papers because of how they perceived them to be unethical and culturally unsafe. Within the researchers, several researchers showed transformation from a methods first framing to a governance first framing. And we were able to reflect on the critical moments that crystallized that transformation for them. And through these cases, we're able to demonstrate that ethical practice in secondary data analysis can transcend researcher identity categories, and that, improvement in researchers' work with secondary data is a feasible goal. So let me show you, what emerged in my analysis. So these 7 meta themes emerged as the key patterns distinguishing collaborative from extractive research. So at the center sits the concept of governance first framework, whether the researchers understand Indigenous governance as foundational to the validity of research or as a mere procedural hurdle. That really interacts with all of the other meta themes. The surrounding 6 meta themes also interconnect. I'm going to focus on 3 today. The idea of cultural validity in relationship to statistical comparability, the idea of information asymmetry and how these relate to governance orientations. The others, reflective limitation reporting, design constraints, disciplinary norms, and principled refusal, operate through these same processes. And I'll be happy to talk about that or, take any questions or discuss that afterwards. So this foundational pattern shows 2 fundamentally different researcher pathways researchers take when working with Indigenous secondary data. So the difference comes down to timing. When does Indigenous governance enter the research process? In the top pathway is an outline of how I understand a governance first framing or a governance first orientation. In this sense, Indigenous governance precedes everything else. The researchers seek Indigenous approval before designing their analysis and involve communities before formulating their research questions. They're asking, what do communities need to know rather than what can I measure or model? And as such, Indigenous governance shapes what counts as a valid research question. One of the people I met with, one researcher exemplifies this transformation. Initially, she conducted research with the variables that were connected or the variables that were collected within LSIC. She recognized that her research with LSIC was almost a band-aid, relying on instruments and variables that had been designed for non-Indigenous populations. And as a result, she completely redesigned her research program. Her team then consulted with 35 traditional owner groups and over 300 community members before finalizing their next research design. They then established a governance structure comprised of 4 elements. So data governance, service provider, community control service provider advisory and engagement, knowledge translation, and community steering groups. And for me, this represents an exemplary approach to how governance can shape research from the outset. Please, compare that with the bottom pathway in which I describe a methods first approach. In this case, the researchers design their analysis first, then they seek governance approval. If they may seek governance approval as a final checkpoint, and that might simply be institutional ethical approval. And I suppose the key insight here is that governance first approaches are not about constraining research. It's an epistemic and ethical commitment that improves research through cultural alignment. And it's about ensuring that research, whether it's secondary data research, is still culturally appropriate research. The next meta theme that I'd like to present is the concept of information asymmetry, which is drawing on a paper from Samin Vazir, where she talks about how information asymmetry can introduce quality uncertainty about the quality of the research. And in research with LSIC data, information asymmetry operates in multiple structural levels. And 2 examples particularly illustrate how these cascade from one level down to the other. First is audience asymmetry. So when I asked steering committee members about their role, they expressed concern about LSIC research prioritizing academic audiences. One of them put put it thus: academic reviewers worry about statistical power, generalizability, and other concerns. But when I present my findings to community, they want to know, did you respect our protocols? Did the research help our kids? And we have different audiences and we have different criteria of research of validity. And typically in the world of academic research, it's academic criteria that win out. And a second key asymmetry is funding asymmetry. And in one of my interviews, the interviewer was very blunt. If you write a formal grant application saying that everything's fine in the Aboriginal, or in this context, they're talking about an Aboriginal community, you're not going to get it. You're not going to secure funding. As they put it, you have to say that non-Indigenous academic is at this level and that there's 25 or whatever percent less in this respective Aboriginal community. And as a result, deficit framing is required for success in securing grant-based funding. And career advancement, academic career advancement structures actively incentivize deficit discourse and deficit framing over community benefit.
Very sorry, Peter. I just want to honor next speakers. I'm so sorry. We just went a little over time.
It's not like the last person.
Please wrap up.
Sure. Okay. It felt like the last person ran over, but
okay. No.
Yeah. Okay. So I won't run over this slide too much. These are some quotes for some of the researchers, and then here are my details. You can contact me should you wish.